making a video. I will call you when I'm done.
Radio Free Intimate episode 331. Gonna switch up things again. Instead of black metal, we're gonna be talking about death metal, specifically technical death metal. Tech death, that odd little offshoot of the larger death metal genre. An offshoot that might be the most easily hateable form of death metal. All aboard the poser train. Choo choo. Oh yeah, baby, you know what time it is. We're talking about sweep picking on a headless guitar in diminished Phrygian Boglinian mode. Our blast beats are 420.69 beats per minute, and it's all done with triggers that sound like echolocating bats. Our lyrical content consists entirely of Buddhist, deep, ecological, LGBT-friendly Reddit posts. Yeah, technical death metal is a pretty easy genre to mock, particularly in its modern incarnation. But it doesn't necessarily have to be a genre exclusively populated by short-haired nerds who think that they're too smart for Mortician. Indeed, especially a lot of the older school technical death metal stuff is pretty amazing. I mean, you got Atheist, 90s Pestilence, 90s Death, Goreguts, even lesser known bands like Polluted Inheritance and Violent Dirge are all pretty fantastic. And that's what we're going to be covering today. 3 technical death metal albums, that is, death metal where the emphasis is on technicality of instrumentation, that also happen to be really memorable in terms of songwriting, incredibly notable in their brutality, and just overall absolutely essential death metal masterpieces. Oh, don't you worry your pretty little head. There is going to be some absolutely brutal slams in this episode. I figured we'd go in order from most closely adjacent to regular old death metal to absolutely bonkers out there weird outer space stuff. But funnily enough, that means we're going to be starting off with probably the most unknown band of the 3. That being Afterlife, a band from Indiana that I don't think I've ever seen anybody else mention, which is a crying shame because they're amazing. But I can think of 2 reasons why they don't really seem to get the attention that they deserve. The first is the production on their sole full-length album, Surreality. I always remember this album being really quiet, and like even when I really turn up the volume, it still seems quiet. And I think I figured out why that is, because I took a flak rip of the album. I opened it up in Audacity. I'm like, yeah, it definitely looks pretty quiet. Hang on, wait a second. What are those? You get these random, like, half a millisecond spikes of audio on some of the snare hits. Not even like every snare hit, like with the first Satanic War Master album. It's just occasionally, like, one drum beat will be way louder than everything else. And it gets to the point where no matter how much you turn it up, the album is still going to sound quiet. Because when it does get loud, it gets loud so quickly and goes back to being quiet so suddenly that you won't even notice it. I mean, it's an easy fix. You just open that shit up after you rip the album and slap a limiter on that bitch. But as it stands, it still is a weird production quirk. I don't know if it's just my particular Grindcore International CD. Speaking of which, that's the other reason these guys probably aren't that well known. They were on Grindcore International, which were a really cool but very small and under-recognized label, operating out of Illinois in the 90s. Their most famous release is probably the first Cyanide album, but I've seen other albums from this label get a little bit of recognition in the death metal underground. Stuff like Morgue with that and Paralysis, who of course are all about that. And yeah, those are both fantastic albums. I own the reissues. I'm sure a lot of you do too. But I gotta say, as good as those albums are, Afterlife absolutely sends them home on a stretcher. Because for one thing, they start the album out with this absolutely monstrous, almost death metal version of Trouble sounding doom riff that builds up the atmosphere quite nicely, going into the first very thrashy sort of riff, letting you know that this album is going to be intense on the variation, and they definitely deliver on that, by then immediately launching into this weird lurching sort of thing, before then going all technical death grind with a little bit of melodic stuff kind of interspersed in between the blasting, before then straightening out into some sort of almost melodic death metal stuff, but the melodies are coming from hell, and there's a substantial amount of thrash to be found here as well, before we finally settle into a fucking groove. We're talking real schizophrenic level songwriting, at the same time with incredibly memorable riffs and a whole lot of atmosphere, particularly when they launch into those very subterranean sounding tremolo picked sections, complete with some absolutely nasty vocals, somewhat reminiscent of Martin Van Drunen from Pestilence and Ozfix, but with more of a roaring quality. Then they bring back that melodic tremolo stuff from earlier before jumping into a little bit of a bass interlude. This shit ain't just technical death metal, it's also very early progressive death metal. And apart from being unnecessarily quiet, as I intimated earlier, the production here actually really helps the music out by having all the instruments being very easy to discern from each other.
아니 촬영 같은 거 하다 보면은
Oh yeah, and as promised earlier, it definitely fucking slams, dude. Check this shit. Fantastic. Proper skull bludgeoning type shit going on here. And given that it's technical death metal, it's also going to have sick ass solos. You could definitely tell these guys did their technical death metal homework, listening to all the bands of note playing this style at the time, you know, Brutality, Suffocation, Monstrosity, but they made their own thing out of it. And a major component of that thing is the crazy amount of riff variety on this album. Because in addition to tech death and slams, you get nasty fucking doom metal sections, even featuring quite a bit of spooky keyboard usage that could be seen as very progressive for the time, despite the fact that it sounds incredibly necrotic, rotting, and desiccated, and it leads into some nasty fucking groove riffs. Like this transition section coming up right here, primitive, and it hits like an international 4700. But at the same time, it's got these spazzy tech death drums going over top of it with the rolls, making for a pretty unique take on this kind of death metal, especially with these thrashy grooves popping up all over the place. Eminently moshable and yet unquestionably technical. This is the kind of tech death I enjoy. It preserves the death part of that equation. And the variety doesn't stop there, because as the album progresses, there is an even more noticeable stylistic change going on, to the point where by the album's end, these guys kind of sound like a Midwestern United States version of early At the Gates, or even the second Cenotaph album from Mexico. It's death metal that features consonant melodies without being, you know, melodeath. And if this part doesn't sound cool to you, I don't know what to tell you. I don't know if death metal's for you. And this counterpoint bit here is just so fucking well done. It leads into a nasty little, more brutal conclusion before coming back after the collapse with something that sounds honestly a lot like Demi-Lich if they were American. Afterlife weren't around for very long. They started in 1990, put out Surreality as a full length in 1992, and then kind of turned into another band called Sephiroth, who also only put out one demo. If any of the Afterlife shit sounded good to you, you should also check out Sephiroth's Moon, Sun, Heavens, and Earth EP from 1994, because it's very much a stylistically appropriate follow-up to the Afterlife stuff. But we don't got time to talk about that one, because we still got two more bands to go through here. Second band, about mid-tier on the scale of death metal weirdness, Oppressor from Chicago. Another very interesting sort of death metal band. This time, they've got a little bit of a dirty secret. But more importantly than that, these guys were pioneers of technical progressive death metal. That luckily also happens to be brutal as fuck and very groove oriented. This first album of theirs, Solstice of Oppression, happens to be my personal favorite of all their released material, and honestly one of my favorite death metal albums from the Midwest in general. The technicality really helps color the songwriting and takes the music in some interesting directions, making the grooves all that more shambling and atrocious sounding, and even incorporating some clean guitar stuff, which is actually really fucking well done. These songs are incredibly well constructed and quite catchy. What kind of question is that? Of course they slam, dude. But as you're hearing right now, it's a weird technical sort of slamming that I haven't really heard be done quite as well by any other band besides Oppressor. Got all these weird sliding, quickly done combination of notes linking together those big heavy grooves, and it's very intelligently written. Check out this transition right here, where they take a prior musical phrase and just keep truncating and repeating it until it collapses into some really well done proggy soloing.
Very Season 10.
So yeah, this album's fantastic, but like I said earlier, this band sort of has a weird little bit of trivia attached to them. You see, Oppressor's initial run lasted from 1991 to 1999, then they reunited in 2003. During the interim time right there, they hooked up with the bassist from fellow Chicagoans Broken Hope to form the Billboard Heat Seekers chart topper Soil, who are a pretty successful mid-level nu metal band.
I'm sick of it!
I mean, I guess I wouldn't really call it a proper sellout, given that they started up a new band to do whatever alt-rock chart-topping shenanigans they wanted to get away with. I mean, everybody needs a day job, and they did bring back Oppressor, and it wasn't like they disavowed their former death metal past. Oppressor put out 3 albums. All of them are pretty sick, but like I said earlier, Solstice of Oppression, by far my favorite, one of the great undersung death metal classics. I mean, I haven't heard anybody else pull off this sort of intellectual clean guitar over top of brutal double bass quite like them. But what really sticks out about this album for me are just its nasty, catchy grooves. Given their penchant for writing really effective grooves riffs, I guess it's not surprising these guys later on found success in the nu metal field. But what makes these groove parts interesting is they never sacrifice any of their technicality. It's never just a straight up slam. There's always something weird going on. Whether it be a weird drum roll or some weird patch of technical fill-in notes. It's like tech slam. And as you're hearing right now, there's also a decent amount of coroner going on with these sort of floating backing chords placed on top of rather ethereal, kind of jazz fusion-y guitar soloing. Highly recommend Oppressor's Solstice of Oppression. And while you're at it, you should probably check out their 2 albums they put out afterwards, because those are good too. But we gotta move on to the weirdest band of this old school tech death extravaganza, that being Salt Lake's Wicked Innocence, who I've always seen as sort of being an unsung, important early brutal death metal pioneer. Perhaps not recognized as much as some other bands because, you know, they're from Salt Lake instead of the Atlantic Northeast. But these guys definitely were one of the earliest bands to play this sort of brutal death metal style. Really heavy on chugs and groove, in addition to the technicality, and a whole lot of those artificial pinch harmonics. At least to my ears, this is every bit as important a part of the brutal death metal genre as stuff like Pyrexia or Afterbirth, but that's not really what they're famous for. See, that's their first album, Anthropological Infestation, which is a cool, you know, early brutal death metal kind of thing. But if you're gonna get one thing from these guys, you gotta get their second album, Omnipotence, which is absolutely essential. And when you hear it, if you're unfamiliar with it before and you considered yourself a fan of brutal death metal or technical death metal or just weirdo death metal in general, you're gonna be kicking yourself in the ass, because this shit is so ahead of its time. For starters, that's like the slam death snare drum sound before slam death existed. But when those vocals kick in, like, this dude is the original weirdo brutal death metal vocalist. He's doing the pig grunts before anybody else was doing the pig grunts. But he also manages to utter pretty much every other weird mouth noise you can think of, all over top of, by far, the nastiest slams of this episode. This is tech death with some sack. Coming at you live, 1995, from fucking outer space. I mean, just listen to this wacky transition here. And not only does this album have some ahead of its time drum production and vocalization, but the bass guitar playing on it has to be some of the best death metal bass playing of all time. And it's right in your face with the way the album's produced. I mean, check this section out, dude.
Dude, this is some good weed.
Straight up outer space weed from the asteroid plants. I don't know what they were on when they were recording this, but it definitely worked for them. And they've also got plenty of that sort of demi-lich but American style shit going on. And in this part, if you pay attention in the background, you can even hear the prior really weirdo riff kind of creeping in before they jump back into the more lurching, primitive style of brutal death metal that also colors this release quite nicely. Wicked Innocence, Omnipotence. Absolutely essential, bizarro death metal. And it just gets more and more bizarre as the album goes on. Like, you got this song straight up about aliens, with some weird clean guitar, spooky shit going on in the background, gradually getting more and more tense before the demi-lich style explosion, and all of these contorted Lovecraftian guitar melodies burst forth. And you gotta have weirdo vocals to match that, so of course you get you know, whatever the fuck that was. That bass is just going fucking nuts. Right up there with the guitars. Oh man, and this part right here, Morbid Angel on acid. That's that good shit. That's what we like to hear. And they layer this shit on top of it too. Watch this. Doug, Cerrito, Terrence, Hobbs, Suffocation, but even more twisted and bizarre. And of course it goes into some more nasty groove riffs, because why wouldn't it? But there's an appropriate degree of finality to the melodies, a real apocalyptic sense of despair as we reach this song's collapsing point, before then going back into some of that weirdo alien abduction style shit from the beginning of the song, now turned completely inside out and anally probed and dissected, vivisected, every kind of sected. It has been sected, and it is quite nasty. Even the protagonist of the lyrics can't believe the kind of twisted shit going on in this song. Man, that's fucking good. Can't get enough of the bass playing, can't get enough of the weird vocals, can't get enough of the fucked up guitar riffs, can't get enough of this fucking album. Wicked Innocence, Omnipotence, absolutely essential stuff. Oppressor, Solstice of Oppression, absolutely essential stuff. Afterlife, Surreality, absolutely essential stuff. All three of these albums, go and get them. Hopefully I've managed to convince you to do so, because this unholy trinity of albums proves that tech death doesn't have to be terrible. Thanks for listening or watching, or whatever you did, and I'll see you next time.
Why did Twitter change their name to X? Probably because people love to bitch about their ex on social media, so Twitter's just like, we'll beat you to it, we'll just call our website X now.